Yeah, and it all links back to debt. There's a
Mhm.
really interesting. I was listening to a video from Joseph Wang, who's sort of known as the Fed guy, and he was talking about a comparison to French Revolution.
Yeah,
At that time, they were sort of trying to they confiscated all the assets
yeah, yeah,
from the church and then tried to create their own system there. And it
yeah,
really affected people. There was, basically hyperinflation, wages stayed the same, but the people who
yeah,
actually made the money were the speculators. So the
yeah.
investors. So it seems like that's sort of it.
No,
Maybe not
it's
that hyperinflation factor, but we are in that scenario where the speculators are just rolling in it.
I fully and completely agree. A hedge fund manager in the early 2000s gave me a book on the French national crisis in the 1780s on French QE 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's interesting if you track what the National Assembly was doing in the 1780s, it was extraordinary QE. And they completely corrupted the market system, completely crushed the middle class. And then what happened after all that exuberance was best effectively autocracy, the revolution, Napoleon, centralization. It's funny. I've done all these interviews, and sometimes I get hundreds of thousands of hits. My favorite interview was a presentation I gave in Frankfurt. It's called "The Cycles and Faces of Gold," and it simply tracks the French in the 1780s for about 45 minutes. How it mirrors exactly what the Fed has done since 2008 in almost every way. It's absolutely fascinating. So the point you make, I completely agree with. I'm not trying to pitch this, but I really recommend people look at that link, The Cycles and Faces of Gold. It's on YouTube. It's fascinating how much what we're doing today mirrors what was done in France in the 1780s with what was effectively QE1 through infinity. And that's what we've done. The difference between the French and the National Assembly in 1789 and the Fed in 2023, 2024 is that the US dollar, unlike the French assignat, is the world reserve currency. So we've been able to postpone the inevitable hangover, but the devaluation of our dollar, which we should get into, is now open and obvious. And the backdoor QE and the direct QE is open and obvious. So it is very similar to Wang's point about the National Assembly in the 1780s. I think people understood history and took a few examples, not just Weimar, Zimbabwe, or Yugoslavia in the 90s, or the ancient Rome, the great examples. But if you even look far, 1720 John Law, 1789 France, 2024 America, America is not immune from the sins of basically counterfeit mouse clicking millions and trillions and billions of dollars without killing the currency to save the system. And when you kill the currency to save the system, when you're in this much debt, you go from euphoria to centralization from the extreme left or the extreme right. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the debasement of our currency. And to Hemingway's point, we're seeing constant war, because you can buy temporary prosperity, as Hemingway said, at the expense of permanent ruin. Since 2008 or 2001, frankly, this is 1913, we bought temporary prosperity for the markets, but we're going to create permanent ruin through inflation and permanent war. And when you look around and talk to anyone in Europe or the US, what do we see, especially in America, since I was born? Always at war. And now we have inflation, which is undeniably sticky and about to get much worse than reported. And that's not an exaggeration. That's the cycles of history. So I completely agree with your comment on France and the parallels to today.